Yes, it's time to start another new season of my Nostalgia Trip games, and we start with another emulation-driven episode, and I can guarantee it's the only episode I will ever be making on the infamous Philips CDI console, so think of it as a very special episode of sorts, if you will. I never had one of these, nor did any of my friends, or at least none of them would ever admit to having one, and emulating the CDI didn't really become a very viable option until, well, to be honest, it still hasn't. So why is this console nostalgic enough for me to make this episode? Well, let me elaborate on that. There was a time in the early 1990s when compact discs started getting a foothold on computers and consoles long before the original PlayStation. Two home consoles that pioneered the use of this technology were 3DO, manufactured by many different companies, and Philips' very own CDI. Most of the most notable games for these consoles utilized the CD format with full motion videos. However, most of the games I remember from the CDI didn't feature full motion video all that much, at least not the kind with people acting badly. Before online gaming became a thing, the first notable step towards that was games being played remotely with your landline telephone on a television show. In Finland we had two of these. One based on the Danish Hugo's Kremtrollen format, which I mentioned in an earlier episode, and another one called Game Over, which was half talk show, half game show, in which most games were played with the CDI, at least up to a point. The host of this show was a rubber-faced half-costume puppet called Vito, voiced by a man who would later become a famous Finnish radio voice, Arttu Harkki. The concept was Finnish, so I doubt this sort of a concept had taken off elsewhere, but if you do know of something similar having happened elsewhere, feel free to comment. Some of my friends and I used to watch Game Over with a semi-religious following until PlayStation took over the program, and the novelty value disappeared completely. So most of the games featured in this episode will be those featured in Game Over, along with a couple of interesting latter-day findings through emulation. First off, we have a fairly simplistic shooting gallery game called Mystic Midway, Rest in Pieces, released by Philips in 1992. Mind you, all the games mentioned today were released by Philips, so no need to repeat myself. Rest in Pieces was the first of two Mystic Midway games, both of which were also released on DOS, which is basically how I first got to play the game myself. The CDI version wasn't an option until sometime this millennium. The teenage me being a huge horror fan, and also a fan of silly comedies, Mystic Midway had both genres represented, so it was an instant win for me, even though the game itself was nothing you hadn't seen 10 years ago. Of course, the graphics were awesome and the sounds were funny, so even something like this was easily accepted at the time. But more to the point, Mystic Midway worked perfectly in the context of Game Over, where the calling contestants would play the game using their phone keys to control the gun. Kind of funny thing was, if the caller had a phone with those old-school, rollable numerics, the games couldn't be played because they worked with pulse signal. The key was to have a phone that would send firm dual-tone, multi-frequency signal. Well, anyway, Mystic Midway Rest in Pieces is probably the easiest way for me to get that Game Over nostalgia trip, if I feel like doing so, because it's the only game on this list that I also have in my Steam library. You can grab it on Steam for just under €5.
With a score like that, it's hard for me to put you down, bud. But success has never stopped me.
The second CDI/Game Over nostalgia trip game is the game I remember seeing the most on the show, Wacky World of Miniature Golf from 1993. The wacky drawing style used in this game and the nice animated sequences are what got me interested in this game, and of course I was already a fan of Leaderboard and Zany Golf on the previous generation platforms, so this looked like a good continuation of that. But oh, how wrong was I. Wacky World of Miniature Golf relies entirely on the novelty of the animated sequences and the comedic narration by a famous comedic actor, Eugene Levy, and leaves very little room for anything resembling gameplay. Oddly, I didn't really pay attention to the randomness of the way the game works when I first saw it on TV, but getting to play through emulation for the first time some 10 years ago was a solid reality check. You can only swing your golf club into one of 3 directions and hope that you time it right. There's no attention to which club you're using, how much swing power you deem fit for the occasion, or any of that stuff. It's just a long-winded game of pure luck, and a lot of funny animations fit for the time period. Since finally getting to play this game some 10 years ago, I have probably revisited Wacky World of Miniature Golf 3 or 4 times, so I'd say once every 3 years maybe. And I probably will continue to do so in the future, even though I don't particularly enjoy playing it. Nostalgia is still a weird thing. Next, we have a nice little collect-em-up puzzle game called Dimo's Quest, which was originally released for the Commodore Amiga and DOS in 1993 before Philips released the CDI version in 1994. Oddly enough, the game's creators released a PC level editor as well as the first, and so far only, 8-bit conversion of the game for the Atari computers in 2016, so the game must still have some sort of a fan base. In the original Amiga version, our protagonist, Dimo, is a candy-addicted frog who is trapped in some sort of a nightmare world of mazes, which you need to clear of all the candies and avoid monsters. For the CDI version, Dimo was changed to a regular teenage boy who likes to skateboard between the levels. As you make progress, the more difficult and complex the game becomes, which is as it should be with these sort of games. I don't think I saw Dimo's Quest on Game Over more than a couple of times, but it did leave me enough of an impression that I remembered it when I first started digging into the CDI catalog years ago. It's easily one of the better games on this list, but considering it's not a CDI original, it's only to be expected. I would definitely recommend this one, but I suspect the Amiga version is more preferable. But CDI is the only platform I've ever actually played it on, even if through emulation, so that's where my bouts of nostalgia take me.
Green.
The only game that I remember that I was even remotely interested on the CDI system that was pretty much based on full motion video action was a game called Burn Cycle from 1994. It's a game that attempted to combine elements of first-person shooters with selectable directions and scripted enemy encounters with point-and-click adventures, but it never felt completely comfortable in its own skin. The only other game of this kind that I actually played a lot around the mid-90s was Siberia, which I've mentioned before in this series, but that one had a little bit more freedom to it. You play as a guy called Soul Cutter, who acts as a courier for stolen data using a hard drive implanted into his brain. Wait a minute, that sounds actually a bit like that movie Johnny Mnemonic, doesn't it? Well, the game starts with you waking up with a virus in your head, which will kill you in 2 hours, so you need to get rid of the virus and find out about its origins while at it. Unfortunately, this is one of those games that is insanely difficult to get working properly in emulation, because the only 2 emulation options I have managed to get working in at least some way are the somewhat overpriced CDI Emu, which I haven't bought, so it doesn't have all the necessary features, and RetroArch, which refuses to use mouse as the primary controller, which is really the only way to play the game with any success, since the keyboard and pad controls are excruciatingly slow. There are Windows 3.1 and Macintosh versions floating around somewhere on the internet if you want to have a more playable version to check out, but otherwise you will be needing an actual CDI to play this. After all, Burn Cycle was what you might call the killer app for the CDI, and remains a good showcase of what the system could do on a good day, so if you're considering hunting down a CDI system, Burn Cycle would be one of the very few must-have titles. The Windows and Mac versions were released to much less enthusiastic reviews, and it was supposed to be released for the first PlayStation and Sega Saturn in 1996, but they were both cancelled. I'm still looking for a CDI along with a copy of Burn Cycle, so if anyone's interested in selling, probably my second most revisited game when playing CDI games through emulation is Hotel Mario, an exclusive Mario game for the CDI, which is one of the 4 exclusive Nintendo licensed games for the CDI, and easily the most playable one of the lot. It's a strange little single-screen puzzle action game where you need to close all the doors on each stage while fighting off the Koopas and stuff. Back when this was a new game, I cannot remember ever having seen this one anywhere in action, but I do remember having seen a review and some screenshots of it. It was also one of the first games I managed to get to play through CDI emulation sometime in the early 2000s, so it's a game I also come back to whenever the CDI inspiration hits me. To be honest though, I don't really think it's a particularly good game, and if you want to compare it to some other Mario games, it's gonna be one of those early arcade-like games instead of the more popular, and infinitely better, platforming adventure games that hardly need naming here. The other 3 Nintendo games for the CDI were all Zelda games, which are all infamous in their badness, but I've never had the courage to get into those, even though I have one of them in my collection because I found it for €1 in a flea market where they didn't know what these games were. Anyway, the reason why Philips got the permission to have some Nintendo-based games on the system was because they were originally planning to build a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, but eventually backed out of the plan, so the deal was made for some licensed games. Not necessarily the best deal that they ever made, but it did result in some Nintendo-themed games that completists will have a hard time tracking down and paying stupid amounts of money to have them in their collections. If I ever get a CDI system in my collection, Hotel Mario will likely be the only Nintendo game for it, other than that one Zelda game that I already have, that I will gladly pay some money for. The final game I will be mentioning for the CDI is a vertically scrolling platformer called The Apprentice, which has nothing to do with the earlier Amiga game bearing the same name by Rainbow Arts. Nevertheless, this game's Amiga-esque look is what I was first drawn to when I saw some screenshots and video footage of this game in some magazine or other. And I distinctly remember this game having also been featured in that game show Game Over, either as a playable game or in a news segment. Either way, it's easily the vaguest memory of any of these games featured in this episode, but when I finally got to play it a few years ago, I couldn't help but get somewhat addicted to it, so I'm including it here now. Because of the large, pleasingly cartoony graphics, it's easy to take an immediate liking to the game, and the infinitely hummable soundtrack also helps. The gameplay is what makes this a proper annoyance, because while the controllability, collision detection and design are top quality, the game is largely about memorizing patterns in the same manner as the 2 Rick Dangerous games are, just slightly easier to figure out, and the traps are easier to dodge when coming across them for the first time. Your only weapon, as far as I know, is a magic missile weapon that you shoot from your wand, but it is slightly uncomfortably slow and ineffective. I have only ever gotten to the 2nd level, but then I only got to properly play this game no more than a few years ago, whereas Rick Dangerous is a game I've been playing since the turn of the 1990s, and I'm no more proficient in that one. The Apprentice is a nice game, and easily one of the better ones for the CDI system once you give it enough time. For my final words on the CDI, I think it's a reasonably interesting piece of home video gaming history, and it deserves to have more presence than it does in the current retro gaming sphere. The problem is, getting one of these consoles in fully working condition and buying the games is really for the select few elite hobbyists who have more money than time on their hands, which rules me out. So emulation is the only plausible option for those of us from the other end of the spectrum, but that presents the problem of the current state of CDI emulation being supremely inconvenient and not fully compatible with every game released for the system. So let's hope CDI will eventually find a spotlight on a system like the Evercade.